Do you think your books, Peter, have influenced people's understanding of crime, or people's view of crime, people's mythologies about crime?
I think, can I just, before I answer that question,
Absolutely,
I have to say a little bit of sympathy I have for this kid, Kona, who was surrounded by armed police with his BB gun, because when I was at film school, back in 1969, and I bought this starting pistol for a scene in a movie, and I was showing it to a friend in a pub one night in Baker Street, and I came out, and Baker Street was sealed off, both ends. I spent the night in a police cell. But equally, I do understand the police point of that. I was at the Crime Museum at Scotland Yard a few years ago, and the guy there has a collection, a drawer full of guns. And he was explaining this to me in the context of the shooting of the guy in the tube, the mistaken guy, the Brazilian plumber.
Stockwell, yeah.
And this guy at the Crime Museum had this drawer full of guns. And he said, okay, you're a police officer. He pulled the gun out and said, real or not real, you're dead. That's how long you have as an officer to make that decision. Sorry, anyway, to answer your question, I mean, Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General of the United Nations some years back, said there's no action we take, no thought that we have, no deed that we do that is uninfluenced by how our mind views its destiny and our body its death. He said every single action that we do in life is governed by our genetic need to survive. And I do think that part of good fiction, part of writing, is about understanding the human condition and survival. And I don't think crime fiction is something that's new. I mean, it's a nice situation that crime fiction today is the biggest sector of the fiction market. But it actually always has been. I have this theory that if you look at Shakespeare, he wrote plays because in those days, people didn't buy novels. Novels weren't available popularly. They weren't available till Penguin started popularizing them in 1935. He wrote plays. But if Shakespeare was writing today, in order to communicate with people, he'd probably be writing novels because people read novels rather than go to plays. And if you look at the plays that Shakespeare wrote, he'd be a crime novelist for a lot of his work.
Absolutely. King
Lear, Othello, Macbeth, go through the canon. And if you go back through the history of literature, if you go back to Sophocles, in his plays, they're all about death, deceit, jealousy, murder. I think almost every writer throughout history, if they were alive and writing today and weren't writing soap operas, would be writing crime fiction. So I think crime fiction is very much, good crime fiction is about examining the world in which we live.
You don't think that Shakespeare today would be writing interactive video games then?
He'd probably be doing those too.
And most of them seem to be about shooting people.
Yeah.
But both of you have worked a lot, I know, with police forces, particularly, well not exclusively, perhaps Sussex Police. I'm going to ask you a question, but before I do, I should say I'm aware we have some senior colleagues from Sussex Police in the audience. So we'll ask one or other of them, or both of them, perhaps afterwards, to comment on your replies. But I think I'm certainly interested. I know you talk about it often in the postscript to your books. You acknowledge the help you've had from the police, and I know, Peter, you've had a lot of involvement. Can you perhaps both you say a little about the interactions you have had with police forces in your professions as a criminologist and author, and how important that's been, or what issues there are in having that relationship?
Well, I think that as a writer, anything that you write about, you have to understand the culture of the world. And when I decided to start writing crime novels, I realized that I really had to understand the world that the police inhabit. And not just the way they look at the world, but the way they interact with each other. And I do find it absolutely fascinating, because a police officer will see, in the course of say a 30-year career, an incredible amount. I mean, just to give you a typical day, I spent a year ago with the duty inspector at Brighton's John Street Police Station, which incidentally I believe is the second busiest police station in the UK. At 7 o'clock in the morning, I arrived there. At 7:05, we had a call there'd been a cot death. And a team of police officers has to go to this house where there's a young couple with a 4-month-old baby who's died suddenly. Now, not only do they have to do all the pastoral care, they're having to treat this house as a potential crime scene because the parents might have killed the child. So there's this kind of very difficult dual balance. At 11 o'clock, a Turkish student was hit by a bus in the middle of Brighton. The paramedics thought he was going to die. The police had to seal off North Street. His girlfriend didn't speak a word of English. They had to find a translator. Luckily, the guy survived. At 2 o'clock, there's a domestic. Turn up to this hammer and tongs fight, go into this apartment where it stank. I mean, where your feet literally stuck to the carpet. There was McDonald's cartons on the floor covered in fungus, and a baby crawling through this 50-inch plasma screen on the wall. And the great line that I was given as we left, having calmed it all down, is it's the kind of place you wipe your feet on the way out. And so on. The police officers see almost every aspect of the human condition. I mean, murder is fortunately relatively rare. Very few people are ever going to be touched by it. But it's much more the ordinary life. And I think a good police officer, what makes a good police officer is actually just understanding life and a high degree of emotional intelligence. And it's a tough job. I mean, one of the things that I'm often asked, would I like to have been a police officer if I'd given my time again? And I think I'd love certain aspects of it, but the guy, you know, so often I'm with somebody and they just see a bloke standing on the street they don't like the look of for some reason. He's a known drug dealer, and they'll get out and stop him and start questioning and maybe search him. And it takes a lot of guts to do that. I'm not sure I'd have the courage.
Do you think, I mean, that understanding has helped you put, in fictional form in your books, police officers that the police themselves are reasonably okay about? Have you had any feedback?
Yeah, I think in general the feedback I get, I'd be interested in knowing from the audience, but is that I portray the police in a fair light. I don't portray everybody as a saint. I have Norman Potting, who's homophobic, racist. Yes. And there isn't a week goes by when I don't get a letter from a police officer somewhere in England saying, we have Norman Potting in our office. But at the same time, I think that what I get really angry about is just the way that so often they're portrayed in fiction. We were talking about this earlier, but my biggest bugbear is almost every TV cop show you ever see, you see cops bickering at each other. And going back to Z cars and Softly Softly, they're bickering at each other and they're always having a go at each other. And there's this kind of atmosphere of kind of aggro. I mean, I have been going out with the police quite regularly for the last 20 years now. And not just in this country, and many other countries. I don't think I've ever seen two cops bicker. The police force is like a military hierarchy. There might be all kinds of undercurrents and politics going on behind the scenes, but police get on with each other because their business is actually solving the crime, and it becomes often very personal. I mean, almost every homicide ends up becoming very personal. That senior investigating officer bonds with the relatives of the victim.